In the quiet village of Ashbury, nestled in the rolling green hills of the English countryside, David and his wife Emma had arrived for a brief escape from the relentless pace of London life. What was meant to be a simple week away at his mother's quaint, time-worn cottage would soon unravel everything David thought he knew about himself, his marriage, and the fragile boundaries of desire. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and wildflowers, the kind of silence that buzzed in your ears at first. Emma clutched her coat tighter as they stepped through the creaky iron gate, the kind of gate that groaned like an old man with a bad back. David's mother, Margaret, was waiting at the doorstep, wearing her usual floral apron, a jar of homemade pickled cucumbers in one hand and a birch broom in the other. Her face lit up with the warmth reserved only for family, and she enveloped Emma with a tight hug before planting a kiss on David's cheek. "Welcome to Ashbury, you two," she said with a smile that smelled of baking bread and gentle reprimands. "No internet, no noise, just the wind in the trees and a bit of peace, eh?" Emma smiled, but David's eyes were already drawn elsewhere. "And here's Libby," Margaret announced, waving a hand toward the garden gate, where a figure leaned casually against the fence post. Libby. The name tugged at a memory David hadn't thought of in years. School days, long afternoons spent lost in chatter and laughter. But this was a different Libby, older, more confident, and somehow charged with a quiet, unspoken power. She wore a loose white blouse, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and a short denim skirt that hinted at sun-kissed legs that had seen more than a few summers. Her blonde hair was gathered carelessly at the nape of her neck, a few tendrils escaping to frame a face that was both familiar and utterly foreign. Her eyes locked onto David's with a gaze that didn't just look. It undressed slowly like a cat stalking its prey. "Hello," she said, voice low and playful. "So this is the husband, huh? Not too shabby." David laughed nervously, the sound a little too forced. Emma's hand found his and squeezed it, a small anchor in the sudden storm of sensations. He remembered Libby vaguely as a bubbly schoolmate, but now she seemed like a force of nature, untamed, fearless. The cottage was a cozy relic, filled with the smells of wood smoke, bread baking, and the faint tang of lavender sachets Margaret kept tucked in every drawer. They settled into the small guest room, while Margaret began heating water for the old stone-built sauna out back, a traditional English steam room passed down through generations, complete with a wood-fired stove. David went outside to help with the firewood, only to find Libby already there, stacking logs with easy strength. She laughed, adjusting her blouse so it slipped just enough to reveal the delicate curve of her collarbone. Something about her was both out of place and yet utterly natural in this rustic setting. "Everything all right with you and Emma?" she asked suddenly, not looking at him. "Of course," David replied automatically, but the question lingered in the air like a dare. "Don't be so tense," she said with a wink before turning away, leaving behind a faint scent of jasmine and something darker, mischief perhaps. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the light softened to gold, Emma retired early, complaining of a headache brought on by the bus ride. David took it as his cue to fire up the sauna himself. The small building was warm and fragrant, steam curling thickly in the dim light from a single bulb overhead. He peeled off his clothes and wrapped a towel around his waist, the heat pressing against his skin, muscles loosening in the humid air. The ritual was supposed to soothe his mind, but an uneasy feeling bubbled beneath the surface. Suddenly, the door creaked open. David's heart jumped. "Emma?" "No." It was Libby, stepping inside with a bundle of fresh birch branches in her hands. "Don't be scared," she smiled, setting down the branches. "Your mum asked me to bring these." The towel she wore hung just under her chest, wet strands clinging to the nape of her neck, droplets glistening on her flushed skin. There was no rush, no bashfulness, just a quiet certainty that "I'm part owner here," she said, as if that explained everything. "Your mum and I built this place together while your lot were off wandering construction sites." David sat stiffly, the air thick between them, as she warmed her hands over the steaming stones. Her voice was slow, deliberate. "I like it hot. To the bone. And someone to beat my back with the birch." Properly. One strap of her towel slipped down her shoulder. She didn't fix it. It was a test, and David felt the heat of more than just the sauna. He poured water on the stones, steam exploding around them. His skin slicked with sweat, and though he dared not look, he knew her eyes were fixed on him. "I won't keep you," she said suddenly, voice dropping. But she lingered, then tossed over her shoulder, "If you need me, call. I'm close by. And I've got a better bunch of birch than this." She left as quietly as she'd entered. leaving David alone with the heat and a strange roaring in his chest. Dinner was a curious affair. Libby sat opposite him, chatting easily with Margaret, praising Emma's salad as she poured shots of homemade cider. But under the table, her bare foot brushed his leg once, just once, and the shock rippled through him. Emma excused herself early, retreating to bed. Margaret followed soon after, and David found himself alone with Libby in the small, dimly lit kitchen. The conversation turned unexpectedly personal. "What about you and her? How's it going?" Libby asked, not looking at him. David hesitated before answering, unsure if she wanted the truth or just a polite lie. "Fine," he said finally. Libby's eyes twinkled, and she leaned forward. "Ever feel like you're with someone but not really there? Like their hands touch you but their mind's somewhere else? And then someone else looks at you once and suddenly you can't sleep for days?" David swallowed hard. The room suddenly too warm. She stood, gathering her cup. "Good night," she whispered. "This stays between us." David remained seated, heart pounding, hands trembling. If she came closer again, he thought, he wouldn't be able to resist. The next morning dawned peaceful, but the tension hung thick. Libby wore a simple robe, hair tousled as if from a restless night. She spoke little, but her bright red nails and the way she gripped her coffee cup betrayed a hidden fire. Over dinner, the atmosphere shifted again. Libby's voice was softer, more revealing. "You're not like I thought," she said quietly. "Not some mummy's boy who lets his wife run the show. You've got fire." David smiled a little wryly. "You figured me out." Her gaze held his, steady and unflinching. There was a hunger there, raw and honest. "Ever meet someone and your body just decides for you? Not love, no. But a craving so sharp it hurts." David's reply was silence. The weight of her words settled over him like a storm cloud. Libby laughed softly, brushing off the seriousness. "Sorry, long day. Just haven't talked like this with a bloke in ages. We all pretend we're strong, but sometimes we just want someone to look at us like that." Her hand brushed his on the table, a fleeting touch that ignited a blaze inside him. "If you said come, I'd go," he thought, but said nothing. She stood, slipping silently away with a whispered "Sleep well." "I don't think you will." Her finger traced his cheek before she vanished into the night, leaving David alone with a fire he couldn't put out. The days ahead promised to unravel even more, but for now the line had been crossed and nothing would ever be the same. The sun hung low over Ashbury by the time David found himself wandering the garden path alone, the cool evening air brushing against his warm skin. The cottage behind him glowed softly, its windows casting golden rectangles onto the tidy lawn. Somewhere inside, muffled laughter and the clink of glasses floated through the open windows, but David felt a world away, suspended between the ordinary and the extraordinary. He lit a cigarette near the old wooden shed, the flame flickering in the soft breeze. The smoke curled lazily upward, carrying away the tension knotted deep in his chest. Just as he was about to stub the cigarette out, the garden gate creaked open behind him without a word. Libby stepped through, barefoot, her long floral dress brushing the grass, the fabric clinging to her curves as if painted on by the fading light. Her hair, loose and wild, shimmered with an almost ethereal glow. She moved with a quiet confidence, like a cat who owned the night. David swallowed the sudden lump in his throat, unable to look away. She didn't meet his eyes but glanced toward the cottage with a subtle nod. "They're inside having tea," she said softly. "Shall we?" They circled the house, slipping in through the back door that creaked just enough to announce their arrival without disturbing the rest of the household. The scent of warm bread and lavender mingled with the faint tang of cider, and for a moment David felt both utterly exposed and strangely at home. Libby cast a quick, sharp look his way, one that held promise and warnings in equal measure. That glance was a silent invitation, a challenge and a confession all at once. David's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Later, when the house finally settled into sleep, David heard the soft click of the bathroom door downstairs. His pulse quickened. The old sauna's door creaked open again, and he felt compelled to follow the sound like a moth to a flame inside. The heat was residual but comforting, the lingering scent of birch and steam wrapping around him like a whispered secret. Libby sat on the wooden bench, draped in a thin translucent robe that clung to her body like a second skin. Her skin gleamed with moisture, every curve highlighted by the dim glow. Without turning, she said, "I knew you'd come." David sat beside her, the wooden bench creaking under their combined weight. Her hand found his thigh, warm and soft, grounding him. Is this real? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Libby smiled, turning to press her lips to the sensitive skin of his neck, her breath warm and intoxicating. More real than anything else in this house, she said, voice husky. The world outside ceased to exist. They moved closer, bodies entwined in a slow, deliberate dance where time stretched and folded. The way her fingers traced the lines of his back, the way her eyes locked onto his. There was no room for hesitation. David's hands trembled as they slid beneath her robe, skin meeting skin with a rush of heat and electricity. She arched into him, lips parted, eyes closed, utterly surrendered. The air was thick with the raw pulse of desire and something deeper. A fragile, dangerous tenderness. Their movements were unhurried, a rhythm born from years of longing and restraint suddenly unleashed. Each touch, each breath was a whispered promise and a confession. The old wooden walls held their secret, the faint scent of birch and sweat mingling with the night. When the moment passed, they lay tangled in silence, the cool night air filtering through the open window. Libby's head rested on David's chest, her fingers tracing lazy circles over his skin. You think you'll regret this? She whispered. David closed his eyes, the weight of truth pressing down. No, he said, voice firm despite the tremor inside. But I don't know what comes next. Her lips brushed his collarbone, a tender farewell and a dangerous promise. Neither do I, she murmured as she slipped away into the shadows. David was left with the echoes of the night. The heat, the touch, the undeniable truth that nothing in Ashbury would ever be the same again. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it a distant haunting melody, like the echo of a secret yet to be uncovered. And somewhere deep inside, David knew this was only the beginning. The morning sun filtered weakly through the thin curtains, casting long pale stripes across the worn wooden floorboards. David lay awake at the edge of the bed, the weight of the night pressing down on him like a thick fog. Emma's soft breathing beside him was steady and peaceful, the kind of sleep that seemed to erase worries and secrets alike. Yet for David the quiet only deepened the chasm growing inside him. He traced the faint lines on his chest, those subtle marks left by Libby's fingers, and sighed. The memories of the night before clung to him stubbornly, like the scent of birch steam in the old sauna, impossible to shake downstairs. The kitchen was alive with the rhythmic clatter of cups and the low hum of morning chatter. Margaret was already bustling about, humming an old folk tune as she prepared breakfast. The scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the sharp tang of black tea. David descended the creaky stairs, the familiar sounds and smells grounding him in the moment. Emma was seated at the table, dressed in a simple cotton dress, her hair pulled back neatly, the light catching the soft curve of her neck. She smiled faintly as he entered, but her eyes held a quiet question he wasn't ready to answer. Libby was already there, seated near the window in a pale blue cardigan loosely wrapped around her slender frame. Her hair was neatly pinned back, revealing the delicate line of her jaw and the slight flush on her cheeks. Her fingers toyed absently with a chipped porcelain cup, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the garden. David caught her eyes for a brief moment. There was no trace of last night's fire, only a calm, unreadable depth that made his throat tighten. Good morning, Margaret said cheerfully, breaking the silence. Sleep well? David managed a nod, though the words felt hollow. The breakfast was quiet, punctuated by small talk about the weather and the upcoming village fair. Emma laughed softly at one of Margaret's stories, her eyes lighting up in a way that made David's heart ache with guilt and longing. Libby's gaze drifted back to her cup, fingers tightening around its rim. David wanted to reach out, to bridge the invisible distance between them, but the weight of unspoken things pinned him in place. Later, seeking refuge, David wandered out to the garden shed, the rough wood cool under his palms. He ran his fingers over the old tools, the faded paint of the wheelbarrow, and the worn handle of a garden fork. The familiar tang of earth and oil was a balm to his restless mind. Without warning, Libby appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft afternoon light. She wore a loose linen shirt over denim shorts, the fabric fluttering with her every movement. Her bare feet were dusty from the garden path, and a stray lock of hair caught the sunlight. Mind if I join you? She asked softly, stepping inside. David nodded, heart hammering. They stood side by side in the quiet shed, the silence between them charged with everything neither dared to say. It's all right, Libby began, her voice low and steady. We didn't ruin anything. We just became honest. David swallowed hard, the truth settling like stones in his stomach. She smiled gently, reaching out to brush a speck of dust from his sleeve. Sometimes the hardest thing is to admit what we really want. He looked into her eyes, clear, unwavering, and full of something dangerously close to hope. I don't want to lose what I have, he confessed. But I don't know how to keep pretending either. Libby's smile deepened, a mix of sadness and understanding. Maybe you don't have to choose yet, she said. Maybe some things just need to breathe before we decide. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shed door, and for a moment the world outside seemed to hold its breath. David reached for her hand, a tentative, fragile gesture. Their fingers intertwined, warmth spreading through him like a secret promise as they stood there. The distant chimes of the village church bell echoed through Ashbury, marking the hour. Somewhere between the past and the future, between loyalty and desire, David realized he was standing at the edge of a crossroads, and the path ahead was shrouded in shadow and light. And in the silence, a whisper: something was coming. Something that would change everything. Something that neither of them could yet see. The question hung in the air, unspoken but urgent. How far was he willing to go before the delicate threads of his life unraveled completely? The late afternoon sun draped Ashbury in a honeyed glow, casting long shadows that danced lazily over the rolling fields and cobblestone lanes. David found himself drawn once again to the small garden behind his mother's cottage, where the scent of wild thyme and freshly turned earth mingled in the warm breeze. The quiet was a balm, but beneath it, a restless energy simmered. An electric current he couldn't quite name. He was lost in thought when Libby appeared at the gate, her silhouette framed by the fading light. She wore a soft, flowing dress of pale lavender that fluttered around her knees, the fabric light enough to hint at the graceful lines beneath. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders in gentle waves, catching the last rays of sun and turning them to gold. Barefoot, as always, she stepped with a calm assurance that unsettled him in the best possible way. "Fancy a walk?" she asked, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. David hesitated, then nodded. The village was quiet at this hour, the few passers-by nodding politely but offering no more than a fleeting glance. They moved side by side down the winding lane, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet as they walked. Libby spoke little, but when she did, her words were carefully chosen, wrapped in layers of meaning. "You know, David," she began, "sometimes life hands us a moment we didn't expect. Crack in the wall. And through that crack everything changes. Not with a bang, but with a whisper." David glanced at her, the intensity in her eyes catching him off guard. "I never thought I'd see you here again," she continued. "Not like this. Not like this." He swallowed, unsure whether to ask what this meant or simply let the silence stretch. "You look like a man caught between two worlds," Libby said softly, "and maybe you are. But sometimes the hardest part isn't choosing a path. It's having the courage to walk it." They rounded a bend to a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed in chaotic splashes of color. David stopped, taking a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. "I feel like I'm losing myself," he admitted, voice rough. "Like the life I thought I wanted is slipping through my fingers." Libby stepped closer, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Or maybe you're finding yourself." For a moment, their eyes locked, a silent conversation passing between them, a mix of longing, regret, and something dangerously like hope. Suddenly Libby's expression shifted, a flicker of something darker passing across her features. She glanced toward the village, then back at David. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, voice dropping to a whisper. "Something that might explain why I'm really here." David's heart caught in his throat. "What is it?" Libby hesitated, then pulled from the pocket of her dress a small, folded letter, edges worn and creased. She handed it to him with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "It arrived this morning," she said. "From someone who knows more about us than we thought possible." David unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant and precise. As he read, a chill crept over him. The words spoke of secrets long buried, of choices made in shadow, and of a past that refused to stay quiet. Libby watched him closely, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and resolve. "This changes everything," she said softly. David folded the letter slowly, his mind racing. The peaceful village was no longer the sanctuary he had imagined. Beneath the surface, currents of betrayal and desire twisted together, threatening to pull them all under as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into twilight. David realized that the quiet village of Ashbury held more mysteries than he had ever bargained for, and that the true journey was only just beginning behind them. the distant howl of a dog echoed through the dusk. A lonely sound that seemed to carry a warning. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. The evening air in Ashbury had turned cool, the fading warmth of the day giving way to a crispness that made David pull his jacket tighter around his waist. The letter felt heavy in his pocket, a weight far greater than its paper would suggest. He and Libby stood at the edge of the village green, the distant glow of street lamps flickering to life, casting pools of light that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. David's mind raced, turning over the cryptic words, the hints of secrets buried deep beneath the village's calm surface. He glanced at Libby, whose usual composure was now tinged with a fragile vulnerability, a rawness he had never seen before. The quiet strength she'd worn like armor was cracking, and for the first time, he saw the real woman beneath. "That we need to talk," he said finally, his voice low and steady, though inside he felt like a man teetering on the edge of an abyss. Libby nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant lights. "There's no easy way to say this," she admitted. "But whatever happens next, you won't be able to unsee it." They turned back toward the cottage, the path illuminated by the soft glow of the moon emerging from behind a thin veil of clouds. The village was hushed now, the usual sounds of life stilled as if holding its breath inside. The kitchen was dimly lit by the flicker of a lone candle. Margaret had retired for the night, and Emma's gentle snores came from the room upstairs. David closed the door behind them with a quiet click, the intimacy of the space suddenly feeling both protective and suffocating. Libby unfolded the letter once more, tracing the elegant script with a trembling finger. "It's from someone who knew your father," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who's been watching, waiting. They say there are things about your family, about the past, that were never meant to come to light." David's jaw tightened. Memories he had long buried, the faint stories his mother had brushed off, the unanswered questions about his father's sudden departure, surfaced in a rush. "What do they want?" he asked. Libby looked at him, eyes dark and serious. "They want the truth. And they want you to decide how far you're willing to go to find it." The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken fears and desires. David felt the old walls of his life crumbling, the safe certainties replaced by a dizzying swirl of possibilities. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp creak of the front gate swinging open. Both of them froze. A shadow moved just beyond the glass, a figure standing in the porch light's halo. David's heart pounded. The night had already taken him far from the life he thought he knew. But this was something else entirely. Libby's fingers tightened around his wrist. "We're not alone," she whispered. The figure stepped forward into the kitchen, revealing a face both familiar and unexpected, a man with piercing eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. "David," the stranger said, voice calm but edged with urgency. "It's time you learned everything." In that charged moment, the quiet village of Ashbury ceased to be a refuge. It became the stage for secrets long kept in shadow, where desire, betrayal, and truth collided, and where one man's journey would change forever. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a promise. The past was no longer asleep, and neither was the danger.